It's been fascinating observing the response to the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. Whereas people used to form themselves into different factions based on things like whether they live in PAP or opposition wards, or whether they are supporters of Man U or Liverpool or some other obscure clubs, now guess how they compare themselves with each other? Yes, now it's I'm Pfizer, you're Moderna, my better than yours. And of course, both can secretly feel superior to, and sorry for the poor Sinovac guys. Some people have embraced the mRNA vaccines as the solution to the pandemic. Others have refused it out of fear of possible long-term effects. And then, of course, there are those who claim it is all a conspiracy, secret weapon for world domination. I'm embarrassed to say that some Christians belong to the conspiracy group. And people have asked me if we have a stand as a church on getting vaccinated. Yes, just 2 points. Number 1, thank God for medical science, which is a gracious gift from God. And number 2, get vaccinated quickly lah, because we want to resume in-person services. Honestly, I'm tired of talking to a camera every week. I miss all of you. If the conspiracy enables all of us to gather once again, man, I'm all for it. So do expedite your vaccination, and I look forward to seeing you once more in September. If there's one lesson we can learn from the pandemic, I think it would be this. We wrongly thought that it was no big deal. Up till March last year, the message from the experts was, no need to panic, the flu is worse. Anyway, it's so far away. In fact, one of the families in our church visited their folks back in China during Chinese New Year last year, and when they returned, they breezed through immigration without any checks. It was only on 11 March 2020 that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. Another error was the official position that masks were not helpful. One well-known minister lectured us that no amount of masks would be adequate if all people in Singapore use it. Remember that one? Thankfully, they had the humility to correct the error and made it a crime not to wear masks. Yet, one more serious mistake reiterated by the WHO even until June 2020, when the disease was already spreading like wildfire worldwide, was that asymptomatic spread was rare. Today, we know that 40% to 45% of infections actually come from people without any symptoms. You see, we thought it was no big deal, that it wouldn't affect me. And we could not have been more wrong. It turns out to be the worst pandemic in a century. In just 1.5 years, it has infected nearly 200 million people and killed over 4 million, wrecking economies and livelihoods and painfully disrupting every aspect of our lives. This month, we are talking about idolatry. And what's alarming is that most people similarly think that idolatry is no big deal. It doesn't affect me. And yet, the truth is the devastation caused by idolatry is far more universal and harmful than the coronavirus. It's a pandemic of the soul that afflicts and cripples everyone, religious and non-religious, and will kill us eventually if not properly arrested. Last week, I introduced some basic concepts of idolatry. I explained that idolatry targets good things, not bad things, that it elevates good things into ultimate things, and that it uses good things to displace God. Today, I want to talk about the problem with idolatry, that contrary to what we think, it is a big deal. I'll be sharing from what I think is the biblical passage that analyzes the effects of idolatry more critically than any other. It is found in Jeremiah chapter 2. It is a long passage, so I urge you to read the whole thing for yourself. I will go through only the introduction and a few selected verses. The word of the Lord came to me. Go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says. I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness, through a land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. All who devoured her were held guilty, and disaster overtook them, declares the Lord. This is God's message to his beloved people Israel, and it paints an incredibly romantic picture. God compares himself to a husband and his people to his beloved bride, and he reminisces about their first love and devotion. Unfortunately, the idyllic picture was shattered because of the people's idol worship. From this chapter, we glean some powerful insights about the problem with idols. In particular, let me share with you 3 problems with idolatry. Number 1, idolatry is equal to adultery. Idolatry is equal to adultery. There are certain Bible passages that we find uncomfortable to read because they contain highly explicit sexual content, and Jeremiah 2 is one of them. Let's look at verse 20 as well as verses 23 to 24. Long ago, you broke off your yoke and tore off your bonds. You said, I will not serve you. Indeed, on every high hill and under every spreading tree, you lay down as a prostitute. Next, verses 23 to 24. How can you say, I am not defiled, I have not run after the Baals? See how you behave in the valley. Consider what you have done. You are a swift she-camel, running here and there, a wild donkey accustomed to the desert, sniffing the wind in her craving, in her heat. Who can restrain her? Any males that pursue her need not tire themselves. At mating time, they will find her. Shrines of Baal, a Canaanite deity, were set up on high hills because they conveyed transcendence, and under every spreading tree because these symbolize fertility. So when verse 20 says, on every high hill, under every spreading tree, you would expect it to be followed by you set up altars to Baal, or you serve Baal. Instead, it says something totally unexpected. It says, you lay down as a prostitute. This is shocking. But the text actually goes further. In Hebrew, what it literally says is, you spread your legs as a prostitute. All English translations moderate into something far more polite, like you lay down as a prostitute. But as you can see, the original meaning is entirely consistent with the analogy that follows, that Israel was like a wild female animal in heat that was easy game for any male animal. Why does the Bible use such explicit images to depict idolatry? Not for shock value, but to teach an important truth. You see, animals have a powerful craving to mate with the opposite sex because from a biological perspective, which I'm sure ancient people understood as well, sex is about survival. The compulsion to mate is so powerful because unless male and female come together, it's going to be the end of the species. Life would cease to exist. Game over. Similarly, there is a spiritual yearning inside us every bit as powerful as sexual attraction. We were created by God, for God. We have a deep need to be ravished by His love, to be held securely in His arms. Without God, there is no future and no hope. We need a bonding with God far deeper and more crucial than even sex. We are incomplete, not just biologically, but also spiritually. When we worship idols, we are trying to find an alternative to God by lying in the arms of something else. We are spreading our legs, making ourselves fully open and vulnerable, and binding ourselves in the most intimate union to something other than our rightful spouse. Idolatry is a horrendous betrayal of the God who owns us and loves us. In the first 2 verses, God portrays Himself in a rather unflattering way. In verse 1, He said that Israel followed Him through the wilderness, through a land not sown. It is like a woman following a man who has no worldly goods, as if God were a pauper, but they were so drunk in their love that all the hardships and deprivation didn't matter because it's enough that they had each other. And then in verse 2, God said, all who devoured her were held guilty, and disaster overtook them. God was portraying Himself as a jealous lover who would not hesitate to beat to a pulp anyone who dares so much as touch His lover. That's why I say it is an incredibly romantic picture. But why would God talk about Himself in such an unworthy manner, in such human terms? I mean, after all, He's an all-sufficient God. Unlike us, He has no needs and no hole in His heart to fill. The mind-blowing answer is that in His love for us, God made Himself vulnerable. He opens Himself up to us and binds Himself to us so closely that His heart can now be broken by us. And when you commit idolatry, you're ripping God's heart out. And because He's an infinite being who loves infinitely, He experiences unimaginable pain. We can also try to think about how heart-rending it must be to have a spouse who commits adultery. And this is just as true of idolatry. There is no greater moral wrong, and we cannot do anything worse to break the heart of Almighty God Himself. Idolatry deeply wounds the one person in the universe who owns you and loves you unconditionally. The one person who has the sole right to your undivided allegiance and love. That's the first problem of idolatry. The second is, number 2, idolatry results in slavery. Idolatry results in slavery. I once talked to someone who stayed in Changi prison. He was locked in the same cell as a teacher who teaches in a junior college, who was jailed for taking drugs. And he told my friend that he deeply regretted it. It not only landed him in jail, but destroyed his career as well. And then he also said, I can't wait to get back to drugs. Nothing is as wonderful as taking drugs. Only this time I won't be so stupid. I'll go to another country to take drugs so I won't get caught. Interestingly, that person said he used to attend Brighton Community Church. He could even name some of you. I certainly hope you are not taking drugs together with him. You see, it's obvious to everyone, but this man himself, that he is living under the bondage of slavery. He's not enslaved by men, but by chemicals. In his mind, he's enjoying the freedom to indulge in the pleasure of narcotics, but in reality, he's hopelessly ensnared and enslaved. He has sacrificed everything precious on the altar of drugs and is headed down the pathway of self-deception and self-destruction. What's not so obvious to us is that idolatry does exactly the same thing to all of us. Look at how Jeremiah describes the desperation of idol worship in verse 25 when he said, "Do not run until your feet are bare and your throat is dry." But you said, "It's no use. I love foreign gods and I must go after them." Here we see well-known signs of addiction. Jeremiah's prophecy is set in the desert place, not a suitable place to go running. Yet we have someone running so frantically that his shoes have totally worn out, until his feet are all blistered and bleeding, until his throat is parched and on fire. Even then he says, it's no use, I must keep running. What is he pursuing so desperately? Not water, the one and only thing that will quench his thirst and sustain his life. Instead, he is running after false gods. He must go after them, whatever the cost. What are the psychological and emotional factors that drive addiction? An interesting answer is given in verse 27, which says, "They said to wood, 'You're my father,' and to stone, 'You gave me birth.'" This person is saying that his idols define him. They give him his identity. They are his source of life and the reason for his existence. Addiction and the ensuing slavery it invariably produces happens whenever we turn good things into ultimate things, like what we saw last week. Once you make something the ultimate thing, then by definition, everything else must be subordinated to it. It's no use. You must go after them, even if it means giving up all the other precious things in your life, because the ultimate thing is your most precious thing. As a pastor, I hear all kinds of heart-wrenching stories. Some of the worst have to do with gambling. If you know someone who's a gambling addict, or someone who lives with a gambling addict, you know what I mean. An addicted gambler would sacrifice all his hard-earned money to pursue his habit. He would neglect his family's needs. He would borrow money that he couldn't possibly return, convincing himself that next time round he would definitely win back enough to repay. And then he would start stealing money from his own family members. He sacrifices everything to feed his need. He's a slave. In a less spectacular way, all idolatry does that. The tragedy of idolatry is that we think we are exercising our freedom by choosing not to worship the one true God, but the false gods we choose would enslave us. When we submit our lives to the one true God, He blesses us and meets our deepest needs. But when we worship false gods, they will demand more and more and more from us in return for the pleasure of false security they give us. We will run till our feet are bare and our throat is dry, and we will continue to say, it's no use, I must go after them. When I became a full-time pastor 19 years ago, the church was 3 years old and had about 200 people. Although I sincerely wanted to answer God's call on my life, in hindsight, I realized that I also told myself that unless I gave up my career and devoted myself to it, the church was stuck. I was the bottleneck. The problem was that for the next few years, the church saw little growth, even though I poured myself into it. And it made me so miserable and angry with myself that I could not do better. It made me resentful towards other church members because I perceived that they were not sacrificing as much as me. It made me angry with God for trapping me in this situation. You know, those days, the prayers I prayed were all complaints of frustration and self-pity. And one day, I was driving down the ECP and complaining to God as usual. And when He suddenly said this to my heart, Tiak Quing, if before I called you into this ministry, I told you that you were going to pastor a 200-people church for the rest of your life, would you have said yes to me, just as a labor of love for me and for your members? And when I heard that, something broke. I became a road hazard because the tears were streaming uncontrollably out of my eyes and blurring my vision, you know. But I remember crying out to God, forgive me for making it all about me. I'm looking to the church for my identity when I should be looking to you. And yes, if that's what you want me to do, yes, I would do it. Please just give me the grace to do it with joy and love. After that day, I worked no less hard for the church, I think harder. But I no longer worked as a slave. I did not love the church any less. In fact, I love it even more, but my sense of well-being no longer careened up and down like a roller coaster with the state of the church. And the funny thing was the church started to grow. And here we are today, by God's grace. Am I free of the tendency to make ministry my idol? No, but when I'm tempted, I always remember that encounter. You know, I used to think and teach that the church would never grow beyond where our leadership can take it, that we have a church of this scale because this is the limit set by our abilities unless we grow. Now, I think that the church is at this size because God knows that this is the maximum level at which I would not succumb to the temptation to turn it into an idol. He loves me too much to want me to become a slave, because idolatry always results in slavery. That's the second problem of idolatry. The third problem is, number 3, idolatry ends in futility. Idolatry ends in futility. We all worship idols because we are desperately looking for security, worth, or satisfaction. Logically, it is relatively easy for most of us to see that physical idols cannot possibly meet our needs because they are objects created, fashioned by the hands of human beings. The Chinese have a remarkably insightful saying, 泥菩萨过江，自身难保. It means that an idol made of mud can't protect itself when it crosses the river, since it would disintegrate. It is used by people to convey the idea that since I'm not even in a position to help myself, don't expect help from me. But it's not just mud idols. All idols suffer from the same shortcoming. That's why Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 27 says, they have turned their backs to me and not their faces, yet when they are in trouble, they say, come and save us. Where then are the gods you made for yourself? Let them come if they can save you when you are in trouble. The problem is that, of course, they can't, because wood and stone have no supernatural powers. They are useful stuff that God graciously provides for our enjoyment, but they have absolutely no ability to deliver us when we're in trouble. Idolatry always sets up false hopes that ends in futility. Unlike most of you watching this, I have lived over 5 decades. So I've seen this truth played out tragically many times all around me. I had a good friend who took great pride in being a competent lawyer. One day, he was sued for professional negligence. And he was advised that it would quite surely be dismissed, as it was clearly a frivolous case lodged by a disgruntled client. But nevertheless, he crumbled and fell into a deep depression. He stopped work for many months and could not function at all. His wife could not cope alone with their 3 young children, so she moved out with them to stay with her parents and eventually divorced him. And one day I visited him in his house where he stayed all alone. He had obviously not bathed, not shaved himself, and when I talked to him, he wept like a baby. It was very painful to see all that happening to someone I loved. Outwardly, my friend was highly accomplished and successful. No one expected that he would cave so spectacularly to something like that. As predicted, the complainant's case was dismissed eventually, but that guy did far more damage to my friend than he could have ever hoped for. Because inwardly, my friend had built his identity entirely on being a successful lawyer. It was a house of cards. The fact that any of his clients would want to sue him brought it all tumbling down. In his time of trouble, his idol could not save him. Idolatry leads to futility because we put our hope in something that just cannot bear the weight of desires that only God can fulfill. I've had parents of my son's friends call me out of the blue, desperately asking for help because they had lost control of their children. And I tell you, these were all wealthy and successful people. And what makes it so difficult for them to accept was they just cannot understand why something like that would happen to them. Listen, if your children are your idol, then one of two bad things would happen. Either you'll be so permissive and indulgent with them that they'll turn into irresponsible, entitled, and selfish spoiled brats. Or you're going to smother them with so much love and control that they will become bitter, resentful, and rebellious. In my first year in university, one of my female classmates got into a relationship and it was so annoying. She could not stop talking to us about her wonderful boyfriend all the time. But one day, another classmate came to me and asked me to rescue that lady. She had been locked up and beaten up by her boyfriend in his hostel room for many days. You see, if you worship your partner, either you're going to be so reliant, emotionally draining that it's going to kill that relationship, or you're going to be so desperate and compliant that you're going to end up being exploited, abused, and disrespected. Idolatry ends in futility. I know all that sounds rather depressing to hear on a Sunday morning, but if it feels depressing, praise the Lord. It means we are making progress because my objective is to shake you out of the complacency of thinking that idolatry is no big deal. It is a big deal. In fact, Romans chapter 1 in the Bible reveals it to be the root cause of all the problems in the world and in our lives. Not only that, it puts us under the fearful wrath and eternal condemnation of a holy God. Yet instead of just punishing us as we so rightly deserve, God provided a way to save us from the penalty and power of idolatry. I'll talk about that next week in our final session. Today, and for the rest of this week, I urge you to reflect on how much idolatry has defiled you and stolen from you. How it has caused you to break the heart of an infinite God who lovingly makes himself vulnerable to you. How it's enslaved and deprived you from experiencing the wonderful joy and freedom that God intends for you. And how he has brought misery and futility into your lives and even the lives of your loved ones. Let's plead with God for a holy hatred of idolatry and seek him for the wisdom and power to turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God.